Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 7th of November 2017, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish, with me in the studio, Mike Robinson, and we're delighted to be joined today by Ian Crane and Vanessa Beeley. Can I just say, Mike, really excellent news yesterday. I watched it remotely, and it was so good to see people coming up and talking about the reality of what's happening in the Middle East without the sanitisation of the BBC in between.
Indeed, but we're going to start with fracking. The protests at Kirby Misperton have been continuing. The Gazette and Herald here reporting the slow walk protest at the fracking site. This has been going on for months now. The BBC talking about hundreds in an anti-fracking union march. This was a union organised march at Kirby Misperton. But even the BBC having to acknowledge that the police have been absolutely heavy-handed. Now, of course, if I bring introduce Ian Crane to the programme at this point. Ian, the police have been heavy-handed since the beginning of the protest at Kirby Misperton. You've been on the receiving end of it yourself, pushed into a ditch, arrested on no charges. But it seems to have taken a turn for the worse in the last couple of days.
Yes, good afternoon, Mike and Brian. It has indeed. In fact, I'm just back in the country, of course, after being in the Southern Hemisphere for my daughter's wedding. So I'm catching up on a few things before heading back to Kirby Misperton. But obviously, I've been watching, very closely what's been occurring there. And after the Union March on Saturday, and it's almost a tragedy that something like that occurs on a weekend. I appreciate that, people have other commitments, but if only that type of event could occur on a Monday or between Monday and Friday, it would have far more impact. But nonetheless, it's a great opportunity for networking and, for sharing what's occurring. And, at Kirby Misperton right now, Third Energy are actually on the brink of initiating the first frack of unconventional geology in this country since the earthquakes, the seismic events were triggered by Quadrilla at Priest Hall over 6.5 years ago. And so this will be a very emotional moment for people in Yorkshire. And as you say, the police have been incredibly heavy-handed. Before the truck started rolling, the people of North Yorkshire seemed to be convinced that things would be different in Kirby Misperton, and that the police would behave in a civilised manner. I think for most people in North Yorkshire, they still have a vision of Nick Berry riding a 1960s moped across the North York moors, because they don't normally see any police, because it's a relatively crime-free county. But Kirby Misperton has had sort of anything up to 100 plus police descend upon it pretty much every day since the beginning of September. And they are very heavy-handed. It's very clear that they've got instructions from on high that they will obviously need to arrest from time to time, but if they can avoid arrest by simply pushing people out of the way or pushing them into ditches, as was the case with me, then so be it. But yesterday, it took a very sinister turn when one individual was actually detained under the Mental Health Act for singing in front of the entrance to the well site. And of course, this is shades of Stalinist Russia, where opponents to the regime were effectively removed from society by being put in the gulag compounds and effectively taken out of the equation. And unfortunately, what we're seeing in North Yorkshire, for anybody that's paying attention, they can't really fail to see that we're not just sliding into a corporatist police state. We're basically there.
Absolutely. So, Brian, this is a major change in policy if we're starting to lift people on mental health grounds who are at a protest?
Well, I'm going to say, Mike, it is and it isn't, because, of course, we've watched now over several years of how mental health services have been integrated with the police. We've warned people about the multi-agency public protection arrangements. We've got the multi-agency support hubs where supposedly the NHS, mental health are working alongside local councils and the police. What you're now seeing is those preparatory arrangements put into place in the field. But yes, you're absolutely right. This is sort of Stalinist stuff at its worst. This is what the gulags were all about, which is if you dare criticize the government or stand up to authority, you are deemed mentally ill and you're put in a correction facility. This is very dangerous.
So Ian, the fracking, the machinery is now all on the well site, I believe, is that right? And they're about to frack. What is the status now with protests around the country? This is going to be the first one. What about Preston, New Road? That's going to be a few months behind, but how do you see this playing out over the next couple of weeks and months?
Well, I think it's really important that, we learn the lessons, obviously, as we go. And as you rightly say, it certainly looks as though Kirkby Misperton is going to be fracked literally any day now. It seems that they have all the equipment and all the material that they need on the site. I must confess, I haven't seen any evidence that they've actually completed the work that they were supposed to have completed before setting up for the frack. But, it wouldn't surprise me at all if they've cut a few corners. But anyway, at the moment, they are simply waiting on the Secretary of State to sign off on the frack. I understand that he has been presented with a bundle of information, which is sort of perhaps a last-ditch attempt to try and get him to delay signing it off. But let's assume that he does go ahead. Then obviously North Yorkshire is about to be fracked. And I have to say that, the campaign that's been running in the Rydale area of North Yorkshire has been absolutely exemplary over the last few years. The community have done everything they possibly could have done. They've explored every possible avenue, both political and legal. And of course, the previous MP for the area, now Baroness McIntosh, but Anne McIntosh was deselected from Rydale constituency because she was vehemently anti-fracking, and she was replaced by an estate agent, Kevin Hollinsnake. Sorry, that's a Freudian slip. Hollinrake, who has effectively been the representative of the fracking industry in Westminster and within the community. And the opposition, the on-road opposition, has not been insignificant. There have been a number of lock-ons, but the reality is that they haven't stopped Third Energy from getting to this stage. So, the lesson that has to be learned really by other communities is that, of course, you have to do everything you possibly can. And right now in Lincolnshire, as we speak, there is an appeal hearing by Egdon Resources, whose application to frack in North Lincolnshire was rejected by North Lincolnshire County Council. And, without doubt, I think that, that objection will succeed, and eventually it'll go, and even if it doesn't, it'll go to the Secretary of State. So although the can keeps getting kicked down the road, eventually somebody's going to give them permission, particularly while this government's in office. They're going to get permission to go ahead with the drilling, or if it's an existing well, the fracking of that existing well. And so communities need to gear up to being ready for physical opposition. And, if there had been 300, 400, 500 people at the well site every single day for the last 2 months, then the situation would be very, very different. But, there's been a handful of people, and it runs in the tens, and there's probably a dozen or so people from the local community that have been there every single day. And then obviously there's probably a few hundred people that have been down there as and when they can. But the average number of people down at the well site has sadly always been significantly less than the police. And in most days, the police at Kirkby Misperton have outnumbered the protection community by 3 or 4 to 1.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, we'll have to leave it there for now. Ian, thank you very much for joining us. Good luck when you go back up there, and no doubt we'll see you back in the studio in due course for another Humanity versus Insanity and Fracking Nightmare.
You will indeed. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Brian.
Okay. What's next? Private Eye, Brian.
Well, yes, and isn't it fascinating that the police can outnumber the fracking people on the ground, no problem getting the police there. But when it comes to child abuse, we have a problem getting the police engaged. But when they do, they are attacked in a way that is just quite extraordinary. So this was Private Eye. I think this came out last week or the beginning of last week. Veal Butcher's Grocer. And this is an amazing attack on the work by the Chief Constable of Wiltshire Police, Mike Veal. So we just have a little look at some of this. This is the key bit, which I think sets the scene. So basically, anybody who pulls apart the work done by the Chief Constable is an expert. So we've got here ritual crime expert Dr. Rachel Hoskins. If you do your work on her, you will find that one minute they're an expert on satanic abuse, particularly in Africa, and the next minute they're writing sort of crime thriller stories. So I'm not quite sure about this person, but the Private Eye says, well, they're an expert. Then where do we go? Well, we've got this, that the claims that there was ritualistic abuse of children going on around Heath. These are preposterous and fantastical. These are just not believable. It doesn't matter that witnesses came forward and told the police what had happened. It doesn't matter that there were a number of those witnesses. Here is Private Eye attacking the Chief Constable, and they describe him as beleaguered. Not that this man had the courage to stand up and do a very difficult job. He's beleaguered. And it goes on. We've got here, the Chief Constable said, let me be clear, this part of the investigation is only one small element of the overall inquiry and does not relate to Sir Edward Heath. So the Private Eye now challenging him that he'd said, well, the satanic abuse was only a small part and it doesn't relate to Sir Edward Heath. So we're muddying the waters there. And then it goes on to say that clearly Veal has a selective memory, or is it a false memory? So this is a very, very deep attack on the Chief Constable. And if we follow it through, the next thing they want to bring in, of course, is Robert Green, who's who of satanic child abuse. This will come as a disappointment to Robert Green, a child abuse campaigner and firm believer in satanic ritual abuse, who was jailed for 12 months in 2012 for harassing people he accused of being paedophiles. Now, that wasn't the exact charge that he was imprisoned for. I did speak to Private Eye this morning, and you did hear the phone going down with some force, Mike.
Absolutely. They slammed the receiver down as hard as they could.
Indeed they did. Just pop this one up and I'll come back to that telephone. It goes on to say that these satanic grocer theories. Now, Private Eye is a satirical magazine, but these are very, very serious things. And according to Private Eye, abuse is something which is simply to do with David Icke. Satanic abuse is to do with reports by David Icke and Robert Green. Well, let's just bring in this. Private Eye doesn't seem to understand that the British government has approved Satanism for use in the armed forces. So I've put two sources on the left. And here on screen, if you want to freeze it, you can call up the information. But I thought we'd just list some of the articles which are published articles of convictions where people have been convicted of the ritualistic abuse of children. So this goes on for several pages. Private Eye doesn't want to get near any of this information. Private Eye simply prefers to actually challenge the Chief Constable and suggest that the whole thing is utter nonsense. They also mention the Rains list. Now, we've been told that actually 2 Private Eye journalists were mentioned on the Rains list. I don't know whether that's true, but it's an interesting claim. But the Rains list, which was, of course, a list of people who witnesses had said had abused them in a ritualistic in a ritualistic way, was so important because there was a minimum of 2 witnesses for each name that was on the Rains list. But of course, no proper comment by Private Eye on that. I think we've got a spoiler article going on here, Mike.
Absolutely, and of course we'd have to hope that there are no Private Eye journalists on the Rains list, because if they write an article discrediting or attempting to discredit the range list and don't declare that, that would be pretty...
Well, it's an omission which is pretty crass, but were Private Eye aggressive? When I phoned them this morning to ask who had written the article, I'm not allowed to know, the public is not allowed to know who wrote the article. And when I then said, I think there's a discrepancy here or an error regarding Robert Greene, the lady slammed the phone down with such force that it could be heard the other side of the office. So I don't know. Private Eye worried, Mike?
Absolutely. Now that article was in the previous issue of Private Eye. This is the latest issue of Private Eye, where of course they're dismissing the House of Commons sex scandals. But in the print issue, at least, they have an article entitled "Beely Mouthed." So perhaps this is a perfect time to bring Vanessa Beely onto the programme. Vanessa, welcome to the programme, and just briefly tell us what they're saying in this article.
Well, I mean, this is an extraordinary hit piece on the Media on Trial event, which was held a couple of weeks ago in London. John Pilger was supposed to be attending. Unfortunately, he got bronchitis at the last minute and had to withdraw. But he sent a message for the organisers and for the audience to apologise, but also to express his support for the event and for the various academics and journalists and ex-ambassadors to Syria, such as Peter Ford, who were there and who were speaking. Private Eye has particularly targeted me for some reason. It's I mean, what is extraordinary is this article. If they came to the event, they have failed to speak to the 550 plus audience members who were there, who gave the speakers standing ovations. And among the audience were people from Syria who afterwards thanked us for highlighting what is often airbrushed by colonial media in the West, i.e. the voices of probably 80% of the Syrian population. Now, the event itself was not about Syria. It very clearly states it was media on trial. That has been completely ignored by Private Eye, with the focus on the fact that there were no Syrians among the speakers. It is then reported exclusively on the opinions of Syria Solidarity UK, who not only desecrated church property prior to the event by pouring what appears to be some form of skunk water onto the floor in the church, but then also came into the event and tried to basically act as a protest inside the event. So they've basically taken their narrative away, and that's what they've published. They've also then tried to highlight a long-running smear campaign against me, which is running on Twitter, run by a Twitter personality by the name of Nav Steva, whose real name is Scott Golk, and who has a record of cyberbullying, harassment and stalking, which can easily be found on the net if anybody wants to go and investigate it. What basically happened was that Golk, when we fell out over Tim Hayward's article about Elliot Higgins, basically then decided to publish private conversations I had with him on direct message on Twitter, which included one conversation about the subject of torture in Syria, during which my perspective was very much along the lines of, we cannot deny it has not existed in the past. We also cannot deny that President Assad and the current government have been trying to reform and to change the existing apparatus. But I mean, there is a whole history to why it happened also in Syria, which is being ignored by this smear campaign. And of course, then, my point always is, are the stories, for example, are the narratives like Sadnaya or the Caesar report true? No, of course not. These are complete fabrications on behalf of the NATO-aligned NGOs and the colonial media. But it's, torture is a global phenomenon. This has always been my point. But do we in the West have the moral superiority to be pointing the finger at Syria when our record in the UK, the record of the US administration of continuous governments regarding torture is unbelievably bad. And then let's talk about the client states. Let's talk about Saudi Arabia. Let's talk about Israel. And in this video, I don't know if this is actually up on the screen at the moment.
It is. I mean, what we're watching is the most brutal torture by U.S. Sheriffs or whatever they are, tasering somebody multiple times who's already restrained in a chair. This is torture. Yeah. This is not using a taser for its correct purpose, which is to take somebody down who's committing some kind of offence.
Or threat to the immediate
threat. Or that's an immediate threat. And we've got police laughing at this guy as he is suffering. So this is torture.
This is a teenager. This is a white teenager. I can't remember in which state this was, but this was on US news about last week, I think towards the end of last week. But then let's examine the extrajudicial executions of Black Americans by American police. I mean, I think in 2015 the numbers were well over 1,000. Let's look at the UK policy of solitary confinement for political distance, or even just for people who are speaking out against government practices.
And Vanessa, let's not forget rendition as well, because this is only from a couple of days ago, because the Belhaj case continues. There's new legal hearings taking place, particularly to try to discover or to do something about the fact that the former MI6 senior officer who was involved in this case has not been prosecuted, and the government won't say why. So the government is clearly not showing any contrition for what happened, Britain has got questions to answer on this issue as well. So your point is well made that we're not in a position to criticise anyone.
No, and I mean, if for example, prior to 2011, when I'm speaking to Camille Octragi, who's covered in his articles the reasons behind torture in Syria, the history of it, prior to 2011, there were 200 political dissidents in jail inside Syria, not the hundreds of thousands that are being put forward by colonial media or by the various so-called activists in diaspora from Syria. So, my point still remains that the majority of the narratives that are coming out about Syria and its torture record are hideously amplified, fabricated, and false. And at the same time, we are not considering our own government's torture record, the torture record of our client states who are effectively creating the conflict inside Syria. So, for example, Israel and Saudi Arabia. It's interesting that only the nations that we are targeting for geopolitical reasons become punishable for their torture record. It's a global phenomenon, and until we recognize that fact and deal with it as such, we're hypocrites.
Absolutely. Now, just to round off the private eye issue, of course, they just make the point that that private discussion, which was made public, they took sections out of it, but they did not publish it in context, and therefore it didn't come across in the way that was intended. So it was pretty poor journalism. But let's move on to BBC Media Action and what they're up to in various countries, and the case of Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe. And well, this has taken a turn because, of course, this lady, a British Iranian dual citizen, has been detained in Iran since the 3rd of April 2016. On the 10th of September last year, she was sentenced to 5 years for, quotes, allegedly, mainstream media saying this in various ways, but more or less the same thing, for allegedly plotting to topple the Iranian regime. Now, Iran accused her of trying to orchestrate a soft overthrow of the Iranian Republic. Now, she's a 38-year-old lady. She is a project manager at Thomson Reuters Foundation, who say that they act to promote socio-economic progress and the rule of law worldwide. But when you look at their website, into media development. They're into countries like Myanmar, Zimbabwe. What are they doing? It's very similar kinds of activities as BBC Media Action, who the UK column exposed. Brian wrote the article in 2014. In this article, BBC Media Action Subversion from Broadcasting House to Kazakhstan. Now Brian's going to be talking a bit more about that shortly, but if you want to get an overview of what Media Action has been up to and who funds them, for example, the Department for International Development and the Foreign Office, amongst others, and USAID as well, have a look at that article. Now, so BBC Media Action, why are we mentioning them? Because she worked for them in the late 2000s. She's now working, as I say, for the Thomson Reuters Foundation. And this is what the CEO of Thomson Reuters Foundation had to say about the charges that the Iranians brought on this lady. They said these charges are linked to her work at BBC Media Action and at the Thomson Reuters Foundation. This is a complete invention, as the Thomson Reuters Foundation doesn't work in Iran and has no program for dealing with Iran, but BBC Media Action certainly was dealing with Iran and of course the BBC has got a Persian service which the Iranian government absolutely despises on the basis that it is pumping BBC propaganda into Iran and people are able to receive it there. Now, of course, she was, Miss Zaghari Ratcliffe was prosecuted, sentenced to 5 years in September 2016. But unfortunately for her, she has Boris Johnson on her side. And so on the 1st of November, he was giving evidence to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Anne Clewett said to him, we raised both here and in St. Petersburg, the two dual nationals, at least two being held by the Iranians. She was at a meeting in St. Petersburg that the Iranians were at. And Johnson said, well, obviously we have to be very careful about this because we want them to be released. I've raised this case many times now with Javad Zarif, my Iranian counterpart. When we look at what Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe was doing, she was simply teaching people journalism, as I understand it, at the very limit. I hope that a way forward can be found, and I must say it is deeply depressing. I think it's totally contrary to the interests of the Iranian people for this to continue. So he has made this statement about her, and unfortunately that was a bit indiscreet, because whether that's correct or not, or whether he was mistaken or not, the fact is he has now made a statement on the record to the Foreign Affairs Committee that she was training journalists. And so she is now looking at further charges in Iran, and they're looking at doubling her sentence to 10 years on the basis, and in fact, Boris Johnson's statement was cited in evidence against her, apparently. Well, Thomson Reuters themselves are demanding that Boris Johnson correct his statement, and they're hoping that that will deal with the problem. But unfortunately, we know, Brian, that BBC Media Action are going into countries with the intention of subverting the sitting governments.
Well, that's absolutely correct, Mike, and UK column articles have shown this. Let's call up this one. Here's proof. This is a lady, Juliet Harkin. I've taken this information off BBC Media Action's website. Remember, they call themselves a charity. What does she say? We, BBC Media Action, worked in 2004 with individuals within the ministry who wanted change and tried to get them to be drivers of that. All media development work that's been done in Syria has, in my opinion, been predicated upon the idea that there can be change from within. You have an authoritarian regime and you find who the reformers are within that and you work with them. This is subversion, Mike. This is a foreign country penetrating a nation state and attempting to overthrow the legitimate government, whether we like it for what it is or not. This is subversion, and hence the article on the UK column website, subversion from the BBC headquarters to Kazakhstan.
Now, look, I think it's fair to say, Brian, that Ms. Zaghari Ratcliffe, we have no evidence that she was directly involved in this. This is the allegation that the Iranians are making. What we can say is that this is the type of activity that the BBC Media Action gets involved in. we can't say that this particular individual was directly involved in it.
Well, as I said a little bit earlier, Mike, I mean, if we wanted to be kind, we can say, does the BBC Media Action suck in naive people, maybe young, inexperienced people, get them to do this sort of work? If we bring this up on screen, we can see what the BBC is about. This is the BBC stirring up trouble in Iran over whether women wear headscarves or not. And they then advertise a campaigner whose work is immensely dangerous to people inside Iran. My Stealthy Freedom. Well, the BBC's not promoting the UK column, but they'll promote My Stealthy Freedom. Why Iranian women are wearing white on Wednesdays or not wearing any form of headscarf. And of course, this could result in them spending time in prison. BBC's just not interested in that. This was an earlier article where BBC Trending is pointing out that if you're wearing some form of hoodie, your face can't be seen, your face is big data. So article after article where the BBC is attacking the laws of another nation state on the basis that the BBC's morality is right. And I put this up some time ago showing the BBC promoting Madonna as being sort of the right morality, whereas the lady who's wearing a headscarf on the right is somehow backward. This is very dangerous, vicious stuff. And we also put up this article, which ultimately also talks about BBC Media Action, because it's highly politically involved with the European Union.
Vanessa, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And I think what is important to point out here is that under international law, of course, the fomenting of any form of insurgency inside a sovereign nation is illegal and punishable. But not only is it punishable, the sovereign nation has a right to defend itself against that insurgency and against the states who are fomenting it. So that's a very important point to make at this point. Our government, if that is true, and the BBC are acting not only immorally but also unlawfully, and that on a under supremacy of law they should be prosecuted for it if it's found to be an absolute that they are doing this deliberately.
Yes. Now, on yesterday's programme, I was discussing with Patrick the situation with ISIS, and we showed a Foreign Affairs, I think it was Foreign Affairs article, suggesting that ISIS was going through a bit of a transformation at the moment, that it's changing from being a regional fighting force to being a global fighting force. Well, that doesn't seem to be the only transformation that's going on, because there seems to be a transformation in how the public views ISIS in the mainstream media. So I just want to show this little video clip which Sky News have on their Facebook page.
About beheading or killing, it was there to defend the Syrians. Honestly, I came here for that first.
Hi, Alex Crawford from Sky News.
It was with ISIS. I was with a terrorist organization. I didn't kill anyone. I hope I didn't oppress anyone. I did have a Kalashnikov and a military uniform, but I didn't hit anyone. I didn't participate in the battle. I was, how do I say it? I haven't spoken English in so long. I was like reinforcements. I was basically reinforcements. Well, I saw the battle in front of me. They would just send one squad, they'd die, and they'd send the same squad, same way.
Do you feel a criminal?
No, honestly, no.
Do you feel a terrorist?
No.
Even though you were part of a terrorist organisation?
It's very, very weird, honestly. No, terrorists, when you think of terrorists, you think someone, with a mask and, with a sword, beheading people and terrorizing people. Well, honestly, I was normal. I was just relaxed, hiding in Raqqa with Syrian civilians, Idlibi friends. They're from Idlib. Playing PlayStation or go around on bike rides and normal life. normal life in ISIS territory. The PlayStation's in Deir ez-Zor, in my house in Deir ez-Zor, but it's probably captured by the Syrian regime now because they took the thing. I have a picture actually. I have pictures on my phone.
Of what?
The PlayStation.
Your story sounds so extraordinary.
Yeah, it's
I
very
mean,
long.
can you imagine anyone believing it?
I want to write a book one day, hopefully. I want to write a book on how ISIS. Of course, no one wants to go to prison. Depending on my prison sentence, that's the problem. I mean, if it's very long, don't want to go back to Britain. If it's short, I'll do the prison and go out and live my life, get a job or continue my studies in politics or whatever.
So, Vanessa, ISIS terrorists, they're just a bit misunderstood.
I honestly, I don't know what to say at the moment. I mean, we're going through such an incredible spin process of normalizing terrorism. I mean, this is combined with the RAND report that came out a few days before the Sky News report, in which Al-Qaeda were almost being put forward, even after all of the rebrands. That was admitted that there'd been a degree of marketing effort to distance them from the extremist ideology of whatever the original Al-Qaeda was. And the scary thing at the end of that RAND report, and I'll read the final sentence. Next year, 2018, will mark the 30-year anniversary of Al-Qaeda's founding. Its ability to establish widespread political legitimacy through a refurbished image could very well propel the group through its third decade and beyond. That is a terrifying statement. It's basically saying that Al-Qaeda is going to be projected and promoted now as a government, as a political force. And we've seen in the last few days the declaration of a government in Idlib, which was predicted by Abdel Haddad, a representative from Malula, some time ago. So we sort of knew that was coming. But I mean, this is just an extraordinary turn of events, and it's something that we have to fight against. We've seen the White Helmets, for example, being greeted by the fire services in New York City, the scene of 9/11. We have Raed Saleh, the leader of the White Helmets, speaking at Harvard on Thursday about the brighter future for humanity. So we have this incredible normalization of what are effectively terrorist organizations that have committed heinous atrocities. I mean, if you watch any of the video footage or see any of the images of the people emerging from ISIS occupation in Deir ez-Zor or in Raqqa, there was a young girl being interviewed yesterday who told us that basically her mother had been beaten to death, her father decapitated in front of her. And yet we have this guy talking about PlayStation and talking about his house being retaken by the Syrian government. It's Syria. Those houses were not his to begin with. I mean, this is the fact that we're even accepting this and allowing this to be played out in front of us, or allowing this kind of extremism to be imprinted on our brains is really frightening. And there was an article in the Telegraph also a couple of days ago stating that a government minister, Rory Stewart, has said that converts who leave Britain to fight for the terror group and should be killed. But of course, then that's being countered by Max Hill QC, who's saying, as you're saying, they're misled individuals, they should be reintegrated into society. We're heading down a very, very, very scary path right now.
Absolutely. And of course, more rumours and reports and witness statements from Syria that the United States is picking up ISIS terrorists and transferring them somewhere else. I mean, we're very quickly running out of time, so just very briefly on this one, Vanessa. These stories have been coming out of Syria for quite some time now. It seems to be a bit more than just rumor. It is actually eyewitness. It is eyewitness reports. Is this the US covering their tracks?
Absolutely. I mean, we've seen it with the blanket bombing of areas like Deir ez-Zor and Raqqa, which, we know the US only does that when it's trying to hide something. And as well as eyewitness statements of the American helicopters removing ISIS fighters from the area of Al Mayadeen, as they had been reported to have done in Deir ez-Zor previously. We're also again seeing what is turning out to be the largest Daesh storehouse of weaponry in Al Mayadeen, also having previously seen a massive weapons cache also in Deir ez-Zor. So, yeah, I mean, this is, we're just getting the layers of the onion peeled back right now.
Absolutely. Now, of course, our favourite alleged funder of terrorism is Priti Patel, and she was in Israel, as we reported a couple of days ago, on holiday. She was only there on holiday, honest gov, is what she said, where she met up with various important people, including the leader of the centrist Yesh Atid party and so on, various other people. She would just happen to be there with the Tory peer, Lord Stuart Pollack, who's the honorary president of Conservative Friends of Israel. He told the BBC that we met up for one or two things. It was the summer holidays. I just joined her for a couple of days, some drinks, some dinner, that kind of thing. And when he mentioned the meeting with Mr. Lapid, he said, well, he's just an old friend of mine, a personal friend. He was more of a journalist than a politician. We just had coffee with him. It wasn't anything formal at all. It was all very innocent. Well, Theresa May now says that she wants to tighten up the ministerial code of conduct to make sure that this type of thing doesn't happen again. Poor old Priti Patel. She has said that she went there on holiday. She paid for it herself. It was a family holiday. Whilst away, she had the opportunity to meet a number of people and organisations. The Foreign Commonwealth Office was aware of the visit. Well, they may have been, but they weren't invited to any of the meetings. They weren't aware of the meetings themselves. She said, in hindsight, I can see how my enthusiasm to engage in this way could have been misread. Well, okay. The Telegraph reporting that while she was there, apparently she was asking or suggesting that perhaps the UK should give aid to the Israeli army. And this was sorry, I've lost track of it. Humanitarian operations apparently being conducted by the Israeli army in the occupied Golan Heights. I wasn't aware of such humanitarian operations.
No, but we can say, of course, that the whole of the Israeli military is funded on aid, and that aid comes out of the United States.
Yes.
So, but there we are. That's what this lady thinks aid should be used for. Remarkable, isn't it?
Absolutely. We've got 3 minutes, Vanessa, so we'll just cover this. Now, last Friday, I sent you a link to the BBC Today programme of last Friday because they were suddenly jumping on the Yemeni problem and the war in Yemen, and they were saying they had a Yemeni doctor on who was commentating, and they said they were going to have many more diaries from this Yemeni doctor in the coming days and weeks. And so I was wondering what was going on, that the BBC has decided to give Yemen some coverage all of a sudden. And the next thing you know, there's a coup, as kind of a coup in Saudi Arabia, and Yemen is locked down extremely tightly, so no air, sea or land access to Yemen at all. Now, you sent me a couple of images from the past because, of course, Britain has had an interest in the past in Aden, and I believe these photos are from the 60s. But so we've had this historical interest in the area. I think we still have an interest, and in fact, that interest seems to be growing. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing happening, 3 minutes is just not enough to cover everything that's been happening in the last 24 hours because it's gone crazy. But actually what we've seen, you're absolutely right, we've seen a complete lockdown of Yemen by Saudi. We've seen the house arrest of the illegitimate fugitive President Hadi. So he's not allowed to return to Yemen. We've had Ansarullah threatening to move missiles to the seaport of Hodeidah in revenge to target any of the coalition ships in the Bab el-Mandeb Straits. But those images are from basically the end of British colonial rule, which began in around 1839 and continued until 1967, when the Yemenis, inspired largely by Nasser's nationalist movement, and also, so from 1963 to 67, they started to push out the British colonial rule. What we're now seeing is we've seen in the past few weeks the move for successionism again in the south. We know that British officials have gone into Aden, and now I am being told, although it is being unreported by any colonial media in the West, I'm being told that the British are pushing again to set up military bases and to set up a presence again, in other words, to reoccupy Aden, which, effectively was a British port before. And we know that there are huge gas reserves, for example, in the Red Sea. So, whatever is going on with the Saudi coup, with the fact that the Sauds are blaming Lebanon and Hezbollah now for the missile strike by Ansarullah forces, by the way, and that's what led to their, whatever it was, this weird declaration of war against Hezbollah in Lebanon, the strange resignation of Hariri in Saudi Arabia, which is not being accepted by political figures inside Lebanon, nor should it be, because constitutionally he should be on Lebanese soil in order to resign. So yes, we're seeing a purge of the oligarchs going on in Saudi Arabia by Mohammed bin Salman, but are we seeing him trying to backtrack out of the war in Yemen with the house arrest of Hadi? Hadi has underpinned the war effort. His legitimacy, which is non-existent, has underpinned the war effort against Yemen. So with his house arrest, are we seeing Salman trying to backtrack out of the quagmire that he's created in Yemen and trying to put on a final leverage, humanitarian leverage onto the Yemeni people, which is going to fail? So I don't actually quite see where he goes from here, because Ansarullah will react, and they will react violently against this, as will the Yemeni people. So in reality, I think what he's going to do is actually lead to more missile strikes on Saudi cities, a potential invasion of Saudi Arabia territory by the coalition forces in Yemen. So potentially he's actually he's leading to a greater chance of a military coup in Saudi Arabia. So, these are kind of extraordinary events, and it's quite hard to read them as they're occurring. But the situation in Yemen is certainly very much of British interest right now.
Absolutely. Vanessa, thank you very much for joining us.
Well, that's it for today's news, and what a mix it is, because we've got terrible things now starting to unfold in UK on a day-by-day basis. This is not accidental. This is government policy. If you follow all of the events that are going on in UK at the moment, you see that somewhere in some dark room, usually with closed doors, this policy is created. If we want to stop what's happening, we have to get the light into those rooms. So don't sit and do nothing. Do contact your MPs, challenge them, speak to other people, talk to your local councillors, and educate people as to what's really starting to unfold in Britain. Deeply sinister, the cover-up of the abuse of children, that is the powerhouse of British government. But what is the British government prepared to do? Give aid to the Israeli army. I think that takes the biscuit today. Vanessa, thank you, and thank you to our listeners and viewers today. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.